Welcome to Lawyering Peace, where we explore diplomacy in action and the legal frameworks that shape peace processes and post-conflict recovery. You're listening to our Ukraine series, where we unpack the legal, financial, and political blueprints that will help rebuild Ukraine after Russia's war of aggression. Today's episode will focus on one of the most significant new tools in that recovery: the United States Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund, a first of its kind investment vehicle jointly established by the United States and Ukrainian governments to accelerate reconstruction, attract private capital, and secure access to critical natural resources. To help us unpack this groundbreaking agreement and make us smart on the topic, I'm joined by Henry Scott. Henry, we're so thrilled to have you. Welcome to the Lawyering Peace program.
Thank you, Paul. What a great pleasure it is to be here today.
Well, let me give our audience, our listeners, a little bit about your background. Henry is a partner in the Los Angeles office of Milbank, which has a 20-year pro bono relationship with PILPG. Henry is a recognized authority in the field of international project finance. He is one of the most sought-after legal minds advising on the intersection of infrastructure, development, and strategic finance. He's a senior member of Milbank's Project, Energy, and Infrastructure Finance Group, where he leads on cutting-edge deals across energy transition, critical minerals, transportation, and aerospace. Now, over the course of his career, Henry has advised on transactions involving multi-billion-dollar energy and infrastructure assets across North America and globally, from geothermal and battery storage projects to onshore LNG terminals to coastal gasification facilities and electric vehicle infrastructure. Now, in particular, Henry brings expertise on structuring debt and equity investments in high risk, high impact environments. Read Ukraine. He's been deeply involved in projects supported by the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, the federal agency at the center of today's discussion. And crucially, for this episode, Henry is the co-author of a comprehensive legal analysis of the U.S.-Ukrainian agreement, together with the Public International Law and Policy Group. So, Henry, let's start at the beginning. What is this so-called minerals agreement between the United States and Ukraine, and what are the United States and Ukraine trying to accomplish with this agreement?
Thank you, Paul. The agreement is a framework agreement for investment and reconstruction in Ukraine. And it does a number of things. One is it signals to the world the commitment of the United States to the long-term partnership and security of Ukraine. The agreement itself is a framework agreement, and by that, I mean that it establishes the legal and financial framework for mobilizing capital investment for reconstruction efforts, particularly through investment in strategic sectors, such as critical minerals and infrastructure. The agreement provides for a fund that's capitalized through a portion of Ukraine's future receipts from its mineral assets, licensing with respect to infrastructure assets, and gives in-kind contributions for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including assistance that's already been provided. So it is a framework agreement. Subsequent to its execution, it has the partners, the Ukraine and the United States, have entered into a more formal limited partnership agreement, which seeks to implement the framework that the public agreement provides. That partnership agreement is not a public document, so we do not know the details of some of the investment activities or governance structures, but the overall framework and architecture for the U.S. participation in Ukraine and the United States partnership is established through this framework agreement.
Well, Henry, you've touched on so many details that I want to unpack and dive into. But let me ask you this question first. When you first read the agreement, given your experience in infrastructure deals, equity, critical minerals, what struck you? What jumped out at you from this agreement?
I think there's two things. One, I think notably there wasn't a security guarantee. And then two, the structure for the in-kind equity contributions and non-cash contributions from Ukraine is unique. In most partnership agreements, there is a financial sponsor that contributes cash and a non-financial sponsor that contributes in-kind equity and oftentimes cash equity or debt. So this agreement really departs from that framework where we have contributions from military and assistance being credited to the partnership. And then we also have the receipts from the proceeds of the partnership coming in to the fund to later expand its activities and pay for reconstruction activities. So that's a unique sort of hybrid capital model, and it's unlike what we often see both in the public and private sectors for partnership arrangements.
Well, Henry, let's talk a little bit about this transformation of military assistance into equity in this partnership. Are there previous examples, or does it ever occur where an in-kind contribution can be counted towards equity? I'm old school. You bring cash
Yeah,
to
no,
the table, you put it in the
I
bank.
would say, Paul, in-kind equity contributions are not irregular in the partnership context. When different parties are coming to the table and have different resources available to them, and it's to their mutual benefit to come together, that's where we often see in-kind contributions working. And here, uniquely, both parties have a desire to share what they can contribute. In the United States perspective, it's the military assistance it wants credit for. From Ukraine's perspective, there are a wealth of critical minerals in Ukraine, which are important to the US for a variety of reasons. And having access to another supply of critical minerals is crucial to the long-term security of the United States. And so this partnership agreement, and it truly is that, a partnership agreement that brings two countries together so that they can mutually benefit.
I'm glad you explained that because that was one of those odd things that, wait a second, credit for military assistance, but it does help the Americans meet their political objective of recouping the cost or creating the appearance of recouping the cost. Well, Henry, you mentioned critical minerals. My understanding is that the agreement has a fairly long list of minerals. Can you walk us through the nature of the minerals that this agreement covers?
Well, it's broad in the sense that it covers a wide range of subsurface minerals. And we're really talking about here are so-called critical minerals for energy and defense supply chains and semiconductors. And those would be graphite, lithium, and titanium. And there are very rich mineral deposits in Ukraine, particularly in the east of Ukraine. And that is what we expect most of the mineral contribution to be about.
Now, can you walk us through how this partnership will operate? First of all, would you characterize it as a public-private partnership, or is it a private entity? What does its structure look and feel like to you? And then how does it operate? It'll have resources, it'll have attached value of the in-kind contribution. What does it do?
Yeah, I would characterize this as a 50-50 JV. There's equal representation on the board from the Ukraine and the United States. So there's shared governance. The governance provisions themselves in the partnership agreement are opaque to us at present, but they will likely deal with board meetings to evaluate investment decisions. To your question, Paul, about what is the entity itself, it is a partnership. A JV take the form of limited partnerships and expect it to be an LP or is an LP with the Development Finance Corporation as the critical limited partner on the US side. It is a legal entity with its own being, separate and distinct from both the governments of the United States and Ukraine, comprised of limited partners who appoint board members in equal amount to run the affairs of this separate legal entity.
And you mentioned the DFC, the United States Development Finance Corporation. What does it normally do? And what will its role and responsibility be in the implementation of the partnership agreement?
Well, the DFC should be expected to be the main engine behind the US in this partnership arrangement. DFC, the Development Finance Corporation of the United States, engages in development activities supporting U.S. enterprises abroad. It has invested both equity and debt in a number of projects, notably in India with respect to solar manufacturing facilities and the like. We've seen the DFC with respect to mineral assets elsewhere in the world supporting development and reconstruction, but also fostering U.S. interests as it respects both the political and financial goals of the United States. It's a vehicle for cooperation and investment and is an instrumentality or agency of the U.S. federal government.
And is this type of role that's envisioned for it in the U.S.-Ukrainian Minerals Agreement something that it has lots of experience and practice doing, or is this a little bit outside of its comfort zone?
Well, I would say it's unique, but being involved in these types of infrastructure investment opportunities is not uncommon for the DFC. This is within its wheelhouse to participate in infrastructure development abroad. So the folks at the DFC are sophisticated. Many come from a project finance background and are used to this type of international development, which is involved in deploying capital to advance development and share the resources that derive from that type of development of natural resources.
So, Henry, if you could walk us through a day in the life of the partnership. And I know it has come into being. We still don't have access to the limited partnership agreement. But if you're thinking about later in the summer or early in the fall, what is a day in the life of the partnership going to look like? What are the decisions that it's going to be making? What will it be doing?
Yeah, so the partnership will have sort of a right of first offer with respect to development projects. And by that, the framework agreement refers to concessions and public-private partnerships. And those are the types of projects for mineral extraction that would be tendered in the global market typically. And here, there is a priority position for the partnership to take on the leading role in those types of projects. By winning the concession, it would be the partnership, the JV that would win the concession, would have a hand in the development of the project itself. I would expect to be the day-to-day activity of the board is evaluating investment opportunities. The government of Ukraine and its local government entities and all those charged with granting royalties and rights to extract minerals and the like has to first come to this partnership with those opportunities, at which point the partnership would vote yes, no on the activity. In addition to that sort of decision making with respect to investment opportunities, is how I would describe them, the board will also have a hand in how those projects are set forth. And a complicated project finance public-private partnership will have many different participants. One key participant is the off-taker, and the off-taker is the entity that buys whatever the resource is that is being extracted or developed. And there's another layer of priority that the framework provides, and that's a priority to the DFC or its designee with respect to the offtake of those minerals. So there's really two layers of priority. One, a priority on the concession itself, which belongs to the partnership, and then presuming that the DFC gives the thumbs up on the investment decision, there will be a structuring of the project. The key structural feature to any project finance transaction is the offtake, and there's a priority with respect to the U.S. government with respect to the receipt of that offtake. And so that's a key feature for the U.S. participation because it essentially gives access to the minerals themselves. And then the fund benefits because it gets the proceeds from the sales of the minerals to the fund. So that's sort of the framework here. There are certain protections that are built into that dynamic. For example, on the off-taker, if it were to be an agency of the United States government or its designee or a private corporation that is operating under this priority framework, it can't then resell the goods at a less than market price. So that's meant to be a protective feature that's included in this framework arrangement.
So in the way that you describe this, there's the beginning part where the government says, right, we're going to make a concession for the development of lithium. And then it goes to the partnership and says, would you like, first right of refusal on this concession? The partnership invests in it by presumably paying some resources to the government for the concession. And then the third part, which is the offtake, when those minerals are sold, that the DFC, other US government agencies, et cetera, or US companies have a first right of refusal at market rate. The bit in the middle, how does this work? Does the partnership then contract out with a global mining company, or who digs in the dirt?
Exactly. Exactly. And the concessionaire, which will be, a subsidiary of the partnership, will set up a program which will be a complicated set of contracts with third parties. And the first contract is the offtake arrangement, because that's the contract that's going to supply the revenues that are going to make the enterprise pencil out. And so once you have that, then you come back and you look to your engineering, procurement, construction. You have lots of different options. Maybe it's a turnkey project. Maybe you have multiple contract providers with respect to the actual construction of the project. There will, of course, be long-term operations contracts and maintenance activities with respect to the projects. All of that will be decisions that the partnership will have to make. The partnership agreement very well may delegate some of these responsibilities to separate boards or members to run the decision making on a day-to-day basis, but we would expect the full board of the partnership to be the decision makers with respect to the most material decisions. And so likely the choice of construction company, the choice of the offtake arrangement, I would expect those all would need to be approved by the board.
And does the agreement, or given the theme of the agreement that you've deduced, will there be a priority, do you think, for Western companies or companies not affiliated? We'll get to this in a second, more detail. Companies not affiliated with Russia's war of aggression, or is that a completely, that bit in the middle, the company that extracts the resources, is that a completely open global bid, or are there a preference for American and some of the other close allies of Ukraine?
I think most definitely there would be a preference. I mean, the board that's making the decision is going to be composed of the United States and Ukrainians and representatives from the governments of each of those countries. So I think we would expect that the decision making will, of course, have that in mind.
And are the global procurement rules fairly flexible to allow for that degree of political preference? I have very limited exposure to procurement rules, and I'm not sure how deep your exposure is. But in an organization or an entity like this, can they play favorites?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there are, restrictions on participation with foreign entities in numerous aspects of US government rules, and I suspect the same in Ukraine. And that's the common feature of restrictions on, who contracts with entities that are effectively owned and controlled by governments.
And presumably this comes from the fact that the Ukrainians are putting in Ukrainian taxpayer money into the investment fund. The DFC is designed to, from what I understand, to promote the role of American companies in development abroad, so that the infrastructure and system is already designed to promote American, and in this case also Ukrainian, or sometimes our friends and allies.
Correct.
Right. So let me ask you a question, which I know the answer to, but I want to ask it because there was a lot of hyperbole early on when this first came out. And I know the nature of the agreement that was announced in Twitter has long since moved past to a more actual detailed agreement, et cetera. But the Meerkats of the world were, oh, this is giving the Americans half of Ukraine's $1 trillion worth of critical resources. Maybe it secretly does, and if so, let us know. But if not, can you walk us through why that's
No,
hyperbole?
I wouldn't say that's accurate. I mean, the terms have to be market. So it does give, as we just discussed, a priority with respect to the partnership and a priority with respect to the US for the offtake. So there is a priority with respect to offering, essentially tendering the minerals, but the decision making will be by the board. I think there's a chance of deadlock, and we don't have the partnership agreement, so we don't know what happens in a deadlock situation. But I would presume that a deadlock would result in no affirmative decision. So, in that respect, both parties retain control over what they do with respect to the choice of offtaker. And the other thing that I would note that in this regard is that Ukraine retains sovereignty over its minerals. The agreement is very clear in that respect. The United States did not purchase half of the Ukrainian critical mineral deposits. What the United States did is it committed to a program, a partnership to develop those minerals and to have access to them by way of this mechanism, by way of this partnership.
Let's delve a little bit into the exclusion of countries and companies supportive of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I don't remember the language off the top of my head, but walk us through a little bit of what that might mean. Now, I know I'm stretching you from your legal sandbox a little bit more into a politically interpretive sandbox, but clearly Russia can't show up and say, hey, we'd love to, this Russian company would love to dig a hole in the middle of Ukraine and extract your resources, or we'd like offtake, we'd like to purchase these resources. But how do you read the language in terms of how far does that extend? And is it just the six members get together and say pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, that's it? Or
Yeah, this framework agreement doesn't get into that level of detail, Paul, but it does provide the architecture for that kind of decision making. And the decision making, as we've discussed, is one in which there's shared decision making. And so we would expect that, counterparties that are prohibited by way of the governmental action on either sides and or viewed as adverse counterparties would be restricted. And that's not unlike what we see in the commercial context for these types of projects, where there are oftentimes restricted entities, adverse parties, where those are prohibited from contracting with. We, of course, as I said, don't have the partnership agreement, but there very well may be a list of restricted entities that is set forth in that agreement. And oftentimes those lists are subject to change and adjusted by the partners. But I would expect that would be something that was at least discussed in terms of putting the partnership agreement together. And in terms of the operation and how this partnership is constitutionally set up, it is done so in a way that ensures that the interests of both partners are protected in a way that there's not dealing with enemies.
yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians have a naughty and nice list, and they're keeping track of who's in and who's out on various Security Council resolutions, arms dealing, things along those lines. So let me ask you, switching to the other of the spectrum, right smack in the middle of your legal sandbox, even within the framework agreement, what types of protections exist to encourage an American company or one of our allies to actually undertake engaging in the extraction of resources, tax breaks, legal protections, dispute resolution mechanisms? To what degree has the framework tried to make it comfortable for companies engaged in
Yeah.
extraction or investors?
Yeah. So, in addition to affording certain tax and currency conversion protections, I would say the critical carrot here is the minerals themselves and the desire to gain access to the mineral supply, where currently the West is facing a shortage of supply and Chinese dominance in this sector in a way that is viewed as a national security threat. So I think that's the principal carrot. But in terms of the overall operation, the agreement itself does provide for exemptions from certain taxes and withholding, exemptions from tariffs and export duties, some lightening with respect to licensing requirements. So it does provide carrots in that sense, although I don't think that's really the heart of the agreement. Those I would expect in sort of any type of cooperative agreement between two governments, that there's a way to address those types of tax and regulatory concerns.
Standard boilerplate in these types of agreements to make it work and functional. Henry, you've been very generous with your time. I just have three more questions for you. The first one is to sort of assess this deal from the perspective of Ukraine and the United States in the actual environment in which it's operating. If it was just, okay, let's go and do a minerals extraction agreement, X, Y, or Z, this is in a situation where Ukraine is desperately in need of weapons. The Americans are in need of access to critical minerals. The Americans have put in 60 billion plus in assistance already. Looking at this agreement through your legal lens, are you sort of nodding your head and thinking, yeah, this meets the objectives of the Ukrainians and the Americans, or are you sort of doing the shrug emoji? Who really knows? We'll have to see how this plays out.
I think that there's tremendous opportunity here for both partners and that this could be a real success. There is clear interest alignment of the partners in the sense that they both need each other. And that's in any good partnership, it's good if you need each other. And the other aspect about this that I think signals success, bodes for success in the future, is that it aligns the interests of the United States and Ukraine in a long-term partnership. These types of projects don't occur quickly. These are decades-long projects that require billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment. So this is a long-term commitment that the partners that Ukraine and the United States are making to each other, binding themselves in this relationship that both parties need to succeed and have a strong desire to see it succeed. So my overall assessment of this is that it has the trappings for success in the sense that the parties at the table need each other, and this is a way that they can bind themselves in a mutually beneficial way for an extended period of time.
Picking up on that for my penultimate question, do you have a sense of feeling that this may be a model for future development in other places of the globe? We don't need to go down this path, but there's a dramatic re-envisioning and restructuring of how America does its assistance. And there's a bit of a knock-on effect to some of our allies as well as to how they're doing it. So that conversation aside, do you look at this model, this agreement, and say, you know what, this is new and innovative, and it might actually provide a model, or we could anticipate or expect that in the coming years we'll see more and more, or this is just the stars aligned with Ukraine and the United States. This is a one-off.
That's a very good question, Paul. I think perhaps we'll see what happens if this agreement is successful, especially if it has near-term successes. Then I think that this will prove to be more of a model. I think that the current administration, certainly this type of arrangement aligns with their perspective of economic growth and investment and sharing in the receipts of their labors and investment activities. And it's truly a deal. It is an exchange. And so I think that there's a good chance that we'll see more of this in the future. All that being said, if this ends up being not a success at all, that not all marriages last, then I think that it's less likely to see more of this. But in terms of could this succeed? Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot that suggests it might. And if it does, will we see more of this? I suspect we will.
Let me ask you one last question. Which question did I neglect to ask that you're thinking, whoa, 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 the listeners need to know this in order to fully understand and comprehend this minerals agreement? Why didn't Paul ask me this question? So now's your chance to answer that question.
Yeah, I would just say, Paul, an important thing to note is what this agreement gives to Ukraine. There's been a lot of focus on what the United States gets, but there's been, I think, less attention to what this agreement affords Ukraine. I think there are a couple of principal things that this does for Ukraine's benefit. One, it signals the political support and then the dollars that are coming from the United States, that this is a long-term commitment. This is a partnership. We're in this together. That signal is key. So that's one thing. We talked about that. The other thing that it does is it provides a mechanic to provide funds for reconstruction. The purpose of the partnership is to turn the receipts, the proceeds from this mineral development into reconstruction activities at home, to rebuild Ukraine. So that also is an important thing to note, that it's a pathway to prosperity and reconstruction using the mutually aligned interests of the United States and Ukraine to achieve that objective. And then finally, I think that it is, and we've touched on this already, but it's really important to underline, the agreement respects the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, that they retain control of their minerals. They retain half the seats on the board. They have authority over their lands, their minerals, and their wealth. So I think it's really key to make sure that people understand this is not a one-sided agreement. This is a partnership agreement that was, heavily negotiated and is aimed at the interests of both sides.
Henry, thank you for answering your own last question, because I think that is crucial, as you mentioned, the sovereignty and the fact that the purpose of the fund is for investing in the reconstruction of Ukraine. Well, Henry, I really wanted to thank you for taking the time for this last hour and the many hours that you put in preparation, parsing through the framework agreement, thinking about it to make myself and our thousands of listeners smart on this agreement. Most of the community that listens to our podcast are focused on peace building, international law, human rights. And this economic agreement, this minerals agreement, plays such a central role in peace building in Ukraine and in reconstruction, as you just noticed. And none of us understand it. So we do now. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time and the enthusiasm that you've demonstrated to share with us. Also, again, to thank you for Millbank, 20 years of pro bono assistance to PILPG. So over 2 decades, it's been phenomenal. I know you, Henry, have personally been involved in so many projects over these last few years. So thank you for that as well. It was a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be able to contribute to this longstanding partnership that we have between PILPG and Millbank.